smelling the cadavers, FYI.
It's just the like the
preservative
chemicals and
with
stuff.
it, yeah.
One of them smells worse. The one in the middle smells worse.
It just has a lot of preservative in it. So, yeah. What? Minty gum. I just like stop smelling it after about 20 minutes. I don't smell it at all. And then I go home and my husband's like, you need to go shower, honey.
I always feel like I get home too, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's stuck in my nose. Like, I see.
Are you starting to understand the muscles at all? No? Yes? Okay. So we're going to work on that today. We're going to work on it in two ways. First off, we're going to finish with all the body movements. This isn't, by the way, all the body movements. It's all the ones that are going to be directly related to what you're doing, though. And then we'll talk about the conventions for how muscles are named. But then the next time I see you on Monday, you are going to have a quiz. And the quiz will be over seeing whether you understand muscle mechanics. Whether I can hook up a muscle in a location and you can figure out which action would be reasonable, right? I'll show you one of the questions because the last class asked me to show them. And then, or if I could tell you a muscle action, you can figure out where its origin and insertion have to be based on that action, right? So the quiz that we have on Monday will be less about muscle memorization than it will be about muscle logic, but it will use structures that I know you know, like specific attachment points, right? So I'll show you one of the questions next time. And it is totally fine if you do not kick ass on that quiz because the quizzes don't count very much, right? But we are going to do it in class so that we can get feedback and you can sort of like stress test your knowledge and see how deeply you're getting this while you still have a lot of time to study before your lab practical. Good? And then before the lab practical, I will write you a beast of a quiz that will be due well before your lab practical over muscles. Only this time, it will be muscle mechanics plus muscle memorization. Right? It'll be open book, but it'll sort of like let you understand whether you get it or not. Cool? Okay, I don't remember how far we got last time. Did we do lateral and medial rotation? Did we do flexion, we did. Flexion, extension, abduction, adduction? Okay. Circumduction? Circumduction? Yes, no, yes. I'm going to believe him. He's confident. He's like, yeah, we did. Not lateral and medial rotation? Okay, we can start there. Okay, so lateral and medial rotation. Again, what I'm trying to get you to do, my goal in doing this is to keep those muscle actions from being memorization. Somebody on the Facebook study group asked yesterday, how do you memorize the muscle actions? Which hurt my heart because you don't. What you do is you understand the muscle actions, and then you don't have to memorize the muscle actions. I want you to memorize as little as you can possibly get away with because memorization does not stick. You have been a human for long enough to know that what you memorize isn't going to be with you, right, in a year. But what you understand, it's really difficult to take it all away from you because you actually can figure it out. So rotation is what we're going to do now. Okay, so with rotation, what you're going to do is move a bone around its own long axis. So you're going to kind of twist it. And really the place that you can see it best is at the shoulders. But it looks like I'm moving my forearms, but don't pay attention to that. Pay attention to what I'm doing on my shoulders, ready? So hold your hands in anatomical position, right? And then twist the bone around its own long axis. That's medial rotation because I'm moving medially, right? Put it back in anatomical position. Twist it around its own long axis the other way. That's lateral rotation, right? Medial rotation, lateral rotation. Got it? Okay. You can do it as well at your hip, but it's hard to see and it doesn't have as much range of motion, right? Okay, so what I want you to do is think about lateral rotation for a second. Let's do that one first. So starting from here and then go twist it back. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm pulling this bone this way. So where should the muscle originate that is doing that action? Yeah, it has to be on the back side. Yes? Back side. Okay. If you want a decent amount of range of motion, don't attach it back here, attach it over here, right? And then you get a decent amount of range of motion. Does that make sense? Okay. So generally, you're going to find muscles responsible for lateral rotation with an origin on the posterior surface of the trunk, right? And an insertion on the limb. Again, the further you put the insertion, the more range of motion. That's one of the differences down here, is that the insertion isn't very far forward, right? So you don't have much range of motion at the hip compared to the shoulder.
Isn't that for
Good.
lateral rotation?
Yeah, did I say medial?
That was on medial.
No, I'm talking about lateral. I have been talking about lateral. Lateral rotation is here. Backside, twist back. Okay, so now medial rotation, okay? Medial rotation will be taking the bone from anatomical position and rotating it medially, okay? So where's the muscle going to be that's responsible for that? Anterior surface, right? That's where the origin is. And the insertion goes onto the bone. Again, the further back you put the insertion, the more range of motion you have. Does that make sense? Okay. So now, with that in mind, let's think about a muscle that you guys should have learned last week, but you might not really understand yet. A muscle that can do a couple of different things. One of the things that it can do is this muscle can help with adduction. The other one is that muscle can help with medial rotation. Any idea what that muscle might be? In. Do it on your body, see if you can feel the muscle. Pull it in, pull it in. So if it's medial rotation, it has to be on the what surface again? Anterior surface. Yes. Yes, pectoralis, which one? Major. Yeah. Goes from here to here because it can do both of those things. Does that make sense? That makes sense? And there's a muscle back here that goes, you may not have learned it yet because you haven't had this one necessarily. It goes from here out to here. Yeah. It's called the Latissimus Dorsi. Does it surprise you that the Latissimus Dorsi, among other things, can also help with adduction and not medial rotation, but lateral rotation? Does that make sense? Yeah, right? It just depends on where the starting position was of the limb, right? And how you actually use the muscle fibers. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay, so that's lateral and medial rotation. Do you guys actually understand those? Okay, and then other movements, these movements are kind of specialized to a few locations. They're not like general flexion, extension movements. Okay, so the other movements, this looks like lateral and medial rotation, and it kind of is, only it's not one bone, it's two bones, okay? So I actually don't call them lateral and medial rotation, but they're kind of the same movement. So the radius and the ulna have between them the interosseous membrane that keeps them spatially separated from one another, but they can actually change orientation to one another, okay? So this is supination and pronation, okay? So if you end up so that you can drink some soup, you just supinated, yep, and it means your radius and your ulna are parallel to one another. Good? If you end up so that you po out your soup, you just pronated, yes, and your radius and your ulna cross one another. Does that make sense? Okay, so now, supination ends up with the palms forward and the radius and ulna parallel. And it's kind of like lateral rotation, yes? Okay. Why is it not lateral rotation? Because lateral rotation is one bone, right? Okay, but it's kind of like lateral rotation. And pronation is kind of like medial rotation. Okay, so this I'm not going to tell you the answer to, but I want you to sit there and chew on it and see if you can figure it out. If you actually understand the action, you should be able to figure out where the supinator is and where the pronator teres is based on the action that they're doing. Because the pronator will pronate and the supinator will supinate. Yes? Supinate, pronate, supinate, pronate. People get those two muscles confused, but if you understand the action, there's only one place you could put a pronator, and there's only one place you could put a supinator, right? Relative to one another. So I want you to think about it. If it doesn't make sense, I want you to think about it until it does, right? Just keep chewing on it until you actually get it, right? Because this is not memorization. A supinator would not work if you put it on the other side of the arm. A pronator would not pronate if you put it on the other side of the arm, right? Okay, so, and then special movements at the ankle. These are named just wonky. It shouldn't be a flexion that is opposite to a flexion, but somebody named it that way and we just have to deal with it. So we have dorsiflexion and plantarflexion. Get up here so you can see them. Okay, so they are named for the side you flex toward, okay? So this is the dorsal surface of the foot, correct? Okay. Dorsiflexion. Flexing toward the dorsal surface of the foot. Okay. So bringing the top of the foot toward the shin. Okay. So where am I going to find muscles responsible for dorsiflexion based on your knowledge of muscle mechanics? So yeah, what did you say? Anterior portion of the leg. And it has to cross what joint? Has to cross the ankle joint. Yeah? If you want to get any range of motion, you better insert it all the way down here onto the metatarsals. Yes. Good. Okay. You can actually work it if they insert onto the tarsals, but you won't get as much range of motion. So it depends on what the muscle's going to do. Okay. So that's dorsiflexion. Plantarflexion is pointing the toes. Right? Good. Flexing toward the plantar surface of the foot. Good. So where would the muscles responsible for plantar flexion probably be located? Posterior surface, yes. Okay. Origin at least up here. You can go further. If you do, you might have another action. Good. But at least up here. And then the insertion has to go down via the calcaneal tendon onto the calcaneus. If you go to the top of the calcaneus, it won't have much range of motion. So are you surprised that it actually goes all the way down to the bottom? Does that make sense? You can pull them up like that. Good? Okay. And then a muscle responsible for plantar flexion. You already know one. Do you know a muscle back there? Gastrocnemius, right? Gastrocnemius. Has to be responsible for plantar flexion, not dorsiflexion, just based on location, right? It can't do dorsiflexion in that location, right? Has to be plantar flexion, okay? And then eversion and inversion are actually relatively subtle movements, but they're really important for stabilizing yourself on an uneven surface. So inversion is when you take the sole of the foot and you turn it medially, okay? And eversion is when you take it and turn it laterally, okay? So even though I don't ask you there, I want you to tell me, where are you going to find a muscle responsible for inversion? Those of you who are being quiet, you need to say it loud, get it wrong, and understand it the next time, because you're being too damn shy for your own good. Where do you find a muscle responsible for inversion? Medial surface, right? Of the leg, crossing the ankle joint. Yes? Good. And you can tell that it actually doesn't insert very far because you don't have much range of motion, right? Same thing with eversion. Where do you find the muscle responsible for eversion? Lateral surface of the joint. Yes? Lateral surface. Good? Okay.
So when I do that, I can feel also on the dorsal side of my foot, I pull. So it must be like wrapped all the way around.
This one?
Yeah, like when I do that, you can feel it on the top as well, like it's wrapped all the way around and pulling.
Well, what's doing is tightening the muscles right there. It's just pulling them on, pulling on the ligaments and tendons there. Okay, and then movements at the jaw and the scapula. These are really hard to see, especially the first two on the scapula. So I want you to kind of think about that when you're in lab and kind of look at how you might protract or retract the scapula. But you can see them pretty easily at the jaw, so I'll show you that one. And then elevation and depression, you can see both places. Okay, so protraction is to move something anteriorly without really changing the angle between the bones. So it's easy to see at the jaw. If you just take the jaw and move the mandible anteriorly, then you end up with an underbite. Okay, that's protraction. Okay, retraction is to do the opposite. Move it posteriorly, end up with an overbite. Okay. And your scapula can do that too, but it's really difficult to both feel and see, like the protraction and retraction. But your scapula can move closer to your body, or you can pop it out, closer to your body and pop it out, okay? And if you're not wearing a shirt, or maybe probably some people who are climbers can do that because you can control that muscle really well. But protraction, retraction, and then elevation and depression is really easy to see both places. Elevation of the mandible is like this. Depression of the mandible, okay? And then elevation and depression of the scapula is pretty easy to see too. Elevation, depression. Good? Okay, so let's talk about where muscles should be that are responsible for elevation and depression, okay? So I'm pretty sure you know a muscle that elevates the scapula. Levator Scapulae. And where is it with reference to the scapula? On the top, right? And so do I have to tell you, or could you tell me which one's the origin and which one's the insertion? Origin up here and insertions down there. Because you understand muscle mechanics, yes? Okay. And even though you didn't specifically learn any muscle that's called a levator depressor, or a depressor scapulae, if a muscle was responsible for depressing the scapula, where's it going to be? Below the scapula, origin down here, insertion on the scapula, right? Okay, so let's talk about this now. So when I do elevation of the mandible, right? Even if you don't know the name of the muscle, especially if you don't know the name of the muscle that does it yet, see if you can figure out where the muscle should be attached to do that action. Where should it be attached? So where?
Zygomatic arch.
Yeah, zygomatic arch to the body of the mandible, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Body of the mandible, that's how you do it. So origin here, insertion there, right? Because if the insertion was here, or the origin was here, you'd be trying to pull your whole damn head down with your jaw, okay? So that is, of course, primarily the masseter muscle. Temporalis helps it. It's the synergist, right? And you don't learn the muscle that does the opposite action, but I think you can figure out where it is, okay? The muscle that does the opposite action has to do this, okay? Where is it? Origin where, approximately, insertion where? Origin where? Down here, yes. Insertion onto the mandible. It's this group of muscles called the neck strap muscles that are deep to your platysma, and they're hard as hell, so you don't learn them. Right, but they're in there, obviously. Good? Okay, everybody good? So that's elevation and depression. And then the last action is called opposition. And opposition is like as in opposable thumbs, yeah? Is the ability of your pollex to touch all of the other fingers. That gives you a tremendous amount of manual dexterity. That in combination with a huge cerebral cortex is the reason that we are in charge of the planet and are not doing a particularly good job of it, right? Maybe we should let dolphins take over, right? Be like, I know you don't have a hand thing going on, but we already jacked this up. So you want to give it a shot? Okay, so that's called opposition. Cool? Okay. So now what we're going to do is you guys are going to provide for me some examples, or for yourself some examples, to figure out why muscles are named the way that they're named. Because if you can look at the muscle name and pick the meaning out of it, then you're more likely to remember it and more likely to be able to pull it up when you can't remember it, right? So let's figure out why muscles are named what they're named. Unfortunately, there isn't one naming convention. There's like 5, okay? However, every single muscle name tells you something, and you should be able to get it out of there. Okay, so first, some muscles are named for their action. So tell me a muscle that is a flexor in its name. Flexor pollicis longus, flexor digitorum, whatever, right? Okay. Tell me a muscle that's an extensor. Extensor carpi, radialis, brevis, longus, whatever. We'll get to those in just a second. So they're not always called flexors or extensors, but if they are called flexors or extensors, don't you know where to look for them? Yes, right? Does that make sense? So do not let yourself call anything on this side of the forearm an extensor, because it doesn't make sense, right? So at least have a good guess that will get you started there, okay? Abductors and adductors. Tell me a muscle that is called the abductor. Abductor, as in to take away. Abductor pollicis longus. Okay, you do have a brevis, but you don't learn it because it's really deep in there. It's hard to see. Okay, how about an adductor? Adductor, AD. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of adductors on the medial surface of your thigh that bring in the thigh. You got a magnus, you got a longus, you got several of them. Okay, levators and depressors. So you guys already told me that you remembered one muscle that was called a levator. What is it? Levator Scapulae, right? And now you know where to look for it, okay? Depressor. You don't learn a depressor, but I'll teach you one because there is one that's called depressor and it's kind of cool. If I write the name, see if you can figure out where it would be. Depressor anguli oris. Yeah, good. Where's it going to? Right here at the angle of your mouth, and it makes you frown. Depressor anguli oris. Okay. You don't have to memorize that one. I just wanted you. I didn't want you to have a levator without having depressor. It offends me. Pronator and a supinator. So your pronator is actually called the pronator teres. What does teres mean again, Seth? It means tubes. It's a long, skinny muscle. Pronator teres. Okay. And then the supinator is just called the supinator, right? And you only got one, and you should know where to look for it if you know what supination is. Should know where to look for it. Okay. Muscles can be rotators. These muscles are not named rotator in the muscle name, but collectively you have 4 muscles that are responsible for rotating the humerus that are called the rotator cuff muscles. Have you ever heard that term? Rotator cuff muscles? Yeah, you can jack the hell out of those things pretty easily. Okay, rotator cuff muscles, and they're responsible for rotating the humerus around its own axis. They also help stabilize the scapula. Some of them do. It depends on which one you're looking at. Muscles can also be sphincters. You haven't run into any sphincters yet this semester, but you will. Sphincters, what do? Yeah, they narrow, they open and close tubes. Most of the sphincters in your body are smooth muscle, but you have a sphincter, your anal sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. That's why you're not pooping right now. And you also have an external urethral sphincter, which is skeletal muscle, and you have control of that one as well. All of the rest of the sphincters in your body are smooth muscle. How about a muscle called a tensor? Do you have one of those? The one that you love to spell because it's just got so damn many extraneous vowels. Yeah, the TFL, the tensor fasciae latae. And you're probably going to spell that one wrong unless you practice it 72 times. You're like, I don't even know, I-E-E-A, and then there's an E-A at the end, whatever. Okay. Sometimes muscles are named for the orientation of the fascicles. You might not know the word fascicle yet, but you'll learn it today. So a fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. And so if we look at this dude right here, who has not had a cupcake in recent memory, okay? You can see that you can actually see in him the direction that the fascicles are going. And if you take off his skin, you can see it even better. But you can't see individual muscle fibers. They're too skinny, but you can see bundles of them, right? And so when you see bundles of muscle fibers, like here's his serratus anterior that you're actually seeing right there, and you can actually see some of the fibers right here as well. If the fibers run parallel to the long axis of the body, the muscle might be called a rectus muscle, as in erect, as in erection, straight up and down, right? So a rectus muscle has straight fibers. You have 2 rectus muscles, don't you? Rectus abdominis, rectus femoris. When you have an us and an is, it's us then is. Rectus abdominis, rectus femoris. Good? Okay, transverse. A muscle can either have transverse fibers or it can be called a transversus muscle. Do you know a transversus muscle? You do. You don't know one? Transversus abdominis. It has fibers that are running perpendicular to the long axis of the body. Transversus abdominis. How about oblique muscles? Yeah, you've got external abdominal obliques that you're actually seeing right here. These are his external abdominal obliques. I'm sure yours look just like this under there. I mean, under somewhere. If you just like take enough stuff off, they look exactly like that. Okay. The oblique muscles, an oblique muscle will not have parallel fascicles or perpendicular fascicles, but at some other angle, right? And so you have these external obliques, sometimes called external abdominal obliques, okay? And the fibers, so let me teach you these so that it'll be a little easier when you get to lab, because most of you haven't done these yet. They're external for 2 reasons. They're both lateral and superficial, right? So they're the most lateral and the most superficial. And the external abdominal obliques, their fibers run X to the 6. Yes? Fibers run that direction. You can see that, right? Okay. The internal abdominal obliques are internal 2 ways. They're both medial and they're deeper, yeah, than these, and they're into the chin. Their fibers run that direction. That makes sense? And although the intercostal muscles are not called obliques, their fibers do run obliquely, and they have the same pattern as the obliques. So let's just go ahead and do those, even though they don't fit directly into this story. I've got my intercostals, and you know to look for them between the ribs, because you're not dumb, right? I've got external intercostals and internal intercostals, and they follow the same pattern that you just learned. They are external for two reasons. Lateral, superficial, external, X to the 6. Yes? The internal intercostals are medial, deeper, into the chin. Good? Okay, cool. All right. Sometimes muscles are named for specific body regions or relative locations to one another, which is part of the reason that I had you do all that vocabulary at the beginning, because this is so much harder than that, right? Okay, but you have that to help you with this now, because you now know, of course, where to look for a brachialis muscle, always in the arm, right? And not here, right? But here, right? Because that's what brachial means. You know two things about a muscle called the rectus femoris. Even if you hadn't learned it last week, you would know two things about it. Straight up and down over the femur. Yes? Intercostals, where would you look for those? Between the ribs. The temporalis muscle, you know to look for here. I've got 3 muscles. They're all vastus, which means big. And these tell you where the muscles are with reference to one another. Hi. I've got a lateralis, a medialis, and an intermedius, right? That's the name of those 3 muscles with reference to one another. And then sometimes I have a superficialis and a profundus, profound, deep. Yeah? Where are those with reference to one another? Superficial is on top, and the profundus is deep. Does that make sense? Okay? FDS and FDP. And then what if I had a supraspinatus and an infraspinatus? Where are those with reference to one another? Supraspinatus is above the spine, the infraspinatus is below the spine, right? Okay. So that's why you took all that time to learn that at the beginning, so it'll make your life a little easier now. Okay. Sometimes muscles are named for their shape or their structure. These are easy. Muscles are named, what are these, what shape is each of these referring to? A deltoid is referring to what shape? Triangle. Trapezius? Trapezoid. Who remembers trapezoid? What is it? I know Seth does. Who else remembers trapezoid? What's it shaped like? Yeah, like a diamond. Exactly. And the trapezius, you guys haven't learned it yet, most of you, because you haven't been to that one. Okay, so the trapezius goes from here to here to here. It's a big diamond-shaped muscle on your back. Okay. This one, Quadratus Lumborum, is telling you 2 things. What's the shape that it implies? Quadratus, square, rectangle, something like that, little 4-sided shape. Okay, where? Lumbar region. That's exactly what it is. It's a little rectangle muscle paired on either side in the lumbar region. Okay? Serratus anterior. What is that telling you? Yeah, it's serrated. That's this one right here. And it wraps around to the anterior surface. Right? That makes sense? Okay. And then platysma. Plat. As in duck-billed platypus. Flat. Yes. It's really flat muscle right here. Platysma muscle right here. It's really thin, it's really flat, it's really easy to lose on the cadavers because it sticks to the skin. There's not much fat here to like separate it, and it dries out really quickly. So whenever you're in the lab working with the cadavers, do not be shy about giving them a squirt. It's going to make your life way easier if you keep them moist because it's way easier to determine the structures before they dry out. Okay, and then a couple other ways that muscles are named. For their size, if you have a longus and a brevis, they're describing the lengths of the tendons of those 2 relative to one another. Okay? And this is important for you to understand. Long versus short, longus versus brevis is not referring to the length of the muscle. It's referring to the length of the tendon, which is sometimes opposite the length of the muscle, right? If you've got a longer tendon, sometimes the belly of the muscle is shorter. Okay? So the longus versus brevis always tells you that there are 2 of these. One of them has a longer tendon than the other. So give me an example of a longus and a brevis from last week's lab. Yeah, ECRL and ECRB. Extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis. Okay? A vastus muscle is great or big. Okay, and we already did some vastus, but tell me where those are. Yeah, they're the quadriceps, right? 3 of the 4 quadriceps are vastus muscles. Everybody with me? Okay. Major versus minor. Do you know any majors versus minors? Pectoralis, you're going to learn some more this week too. There's teres in the back. And yeah, so you're going to, so major versus minor, one of them, there are 2 of them, and one of them's bigger than the other. Good? Okay. And then maximus, minimus, and sometimes medius in the middle. Those are biggest, smallest, somewhere in the middle, and that's the gluteus, right? Okay. And then this is how I wish all muscles were named, but nobody asked me. Because when they name muscles for the attachments, it immediately tells you where the muscle is. And if I tell you that they always list the origin before the insertion when it's named, then not only do you know where it is, you kind of know what it does already, right? Does that make sense? So a muscle called the Brachioradialis, it's going from here to here, yes? And you automatically kind of get an inkling of what it does, don't you? Because origin here, insertion here, you're like, oh, I don't know for sure, but I'm going to guess, right, that it does an elbow movement. And I'm going to guess, if I just look at the location, that it does what? Flexion or extension? Yeah. Good? Okay. So sternocleidomastoid. Okay, so we're going to spend a minute on this muscle because it confuses the living hell out of everyone, myself included when I learned it, but you can do it today. So origins listed before insertions, sternum, cleido as in clavicle, right? Mastoid process of the temporal bone, sternocleidomastoid. Everybody with me? Okay. Now, it has 2 heads. It has a sternal head and it has a clavicular head. You with me? Okay. If you use both of them simultaneously on both sides, what it will do is this, which is what action? Flexion of the neck or flexion out the neck. Good. Okay. But if I use both heads of this one, just the right one, it'll do this action. It's called lateral flexion. Okay. But here's what confuses the hell out of people. You ready? Feel your neck when you do it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am just going to flex the sternal head of the right sternocleidomastoid, just this one. What it's going to do is feel, and you can feel it when you're doing it. It is going to rotate the head to which side if I use my right one? Left. To the left side. Okay? Do you see it? Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you again, but the other way. I want you guys to show me lateral flexion to the left side. Good. Now I want you to tell me which muscles are responsible for doing it. Both heads of the what? Sternocleidomastoid? Left sternocleidomastoid. Good. Okay. Now I want you to show me anterior, just regular flexion of the neck. Which muscles are responsible for doing it? Both heads of the left and right sternocleidomastoid. Okay. Now I want somebody to tell me how I would cause rotation to the right side. Rotation of the neck to the right side. Raise your hand if you think you can do it. Use the words. Show me what rotation is to the right side first. Okay. Seth, you want to do it?
Yeah, so it'd be just the sternal head of the left sternocleidomastoid.
Right. Can you feel that? If you don't get it, I want you to hold your head, twist it to one side, and feel which muscle is engaged in the process. Do you feel it? It's the one on the opposite side, right? Good. Okay. It's not intuitive, but once you do it, right, because you have the tools, right, you can actually get what's going on there. So that's one of those times in which just reading the description in the lab manual is nowhere near as good as wiggling your body around. Okay, you don't learn this one, but the sternohyoid, if origin is listed first, right, it's going from the sternum to the hyoid bone, what do you think it could do to your hyoid bone? Pull it up or pull it down? Pull it down. Yeah, it pulls it down. It's involved in like swallowing and that kind of stuff. Good? Okay. And then the last thing before I sort of quiz you on like, not graded quiz, is just muscles are sometimes named for their number of origins. Sometimes you can have multiple origins that share a common insertion point, and then those muscles are kind of grouped together. Is that okay? Okay, so if it is a seps muscle, it is sharing its common insertion. So you have 2 biceps muscles, It's two origins with a common insertion. What are your two biceps muscles? Biceps brachii and biceps femoris. Okay, now figure out where they are and tell me an action that each one of them does at that joint. What does the biceps brachii do here? Flexion of the elbow. Okay, what does the biceps femoris do? Flexion at the knee. Yes? Good? Okay, even though they're on opposite sides, that's just how the knee works. Everybody okay? Three origins with a common insertion is called a triceps muscle. Okay, you only have one that I know of, right? What is it? Triceps brachii, good. And then a four origin is either called that muscle or that group. I have a muscle group with four origins. It's called the Quadriceps Femoris group, right? Okay. They used to consider all four of those one muscle, so it was called collectively the Quadriceps Femoris, and then they separated them out and said there's actually four individual muscles, but they all share a common insertion point. Everybody good? Okay. And what are those four muscles in the Quadriceps Femoris group? Do you know? Rectus femoris, that's one of them. And then the three vastuses. Yeah? Vastus lateralis, intermedius, medialis. Got it? Okay. And one of those has a different, really distant origin than the other ones. That one's going to have a different function, an extra function, right? Because they all share a common insertion point, but one of them actually goes past the hip. So I want you to think about that. Like, so if you know where its attachment points are, you know that it could actually have a different function, and you don't have to memorize that that's the one with a different function. Okay, so let's imagine that you were you hadn't studied anatomy yet, but you knew terminology enough to figure out what a muscle name was trying to tell you. So what can you determine about these muscles by their names? A muscle that is called the Tibialis Anterior is going to be where? Anterior surface of the tibia. So, logically, friends, is that muscle more likely to be a dorsiflexor, plantarflexor, evertor, or inverter? Dorsiflexor. Yeah? Does that make sense? Okay. A temporalis muscle, if its origin is here, its insertion is here. Is it more likely to elevate or depress the mandible? Elevate. Yes. Good. Yeah. Sternohyoid, we already talked about. Supraspinatus, right? What are you looking for? Finding a spine, and I'm looking above it. You only will know one supraspinatus muscle, but there could be more because there's more spines, right? You're not going to learn anymore. Okay, you haven't learned this one yet unless you've already been to lab today. The erector spinae muscles. See if you can figure out what it might be implying to you. Erector spinae. Erector straight up and down, right? And where? Right next to the spine, okay? I'll give you two possibilities for that muscle. Do you think that muscle is responsible for flexion of the vertebral column or extension of the vertebral column? Extension, yes, good. Do you see? Okay. Flexor, Carpi, Radialis. What is that telling you? Flexor is telling you it's probably on the anterior surface. It's crossing the carpal buttons, and it's on the, or carpal buttons? Carpal bones. It's on the, yeah, the radial or the lateral side. Got it? Okay. Depressor anguli oris, we already did. Vastus intermedius, it is a big muscle, and it's in the middle of some other big muscles. Good? Levator Scapulae, we already did. Good? Okay. So did you guys learn the forearm formula in lab? Some lab instructors teach it, some of them don't. Okay. So let's practice with it a little bit, because can we admit that those damn forearm muscles are hard? Okay. There is a way not to make them easy, but to make them logical. They still don't get easy. They're not even easy for me. Okay? So they call this the forearm formula, but it's not just for forearms. It's just the place that you really need it. And the forearm muscles can have up to 4 words in their names. Okay? Like for instance, let's get through the first one. Extensor, Carpi, Radialis, Radialis. So, but the names mean something specific. What does the first word tell you? Action, yes. What does the second word tell you? Insertion. word tell you? Location. Yes? And the fourth word is a descriptor. And it might not be necessary. So listen to me for just a second. Okay. If you only have one of them, you don't need to go any further. Okay? So if I just have flexor digitorum, I can stop, right? But if there are two, then I need to tell you where they are with reference to one another, right? And if there are more, I'm going to have to tell you whether it's a long tendon, a short tendon, a superficialis, or profundus. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk about why this one has 4 names, okay? So I've got an extensor carpi radialis brevis, but I also have an extensor carpi radialis longus. So do you see why I needed a 4th descriptor term? Because there are 2 there. There are 2 that are on the radial side, right? What about these 2? I don't actually need 4 words for these 2. What about the flexor carpi ulnaris? Are there 2 ulnarises? No, but there is another one. What's the other one? Flexor carpi radialis. So do you see why I need to distinguish those from one another? There was only one flexor carpi, you wouldn't have another name. But because there were 2 flexor carpis, one of them's radialis, one of them's ulnaris, right? If there were 2 ulnarises, you'd need another word. Yes? You need a longus versus a brevis, or a superficialis versus a profundus, right? So if there is a longus, just so you know, there is a brevis, you might not know it or learn it. So for instance, isn't there a longus here? What's that one? The flexor pollicis longus? But you don't learn a brevis. There is a brevis in there. It's just a really hard little bugger to find in there. It's way down in there. Okay? Does that make sense? So what you are doing when you break down the forearms is you are figuring out what each word tells you, right? And when you do that, you can do it by process of elimination, right? Because it's not just a rote memorization. You're like, all right, that's a flexor, cool. It goes past the carpes, so I know that it does this, right? Okay, flexor carpi, it's on this side, so it's going to be the radialis, right? And there are 2 of them. So I'm going to have a longus versus a brevis, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so what I would challenge you to do is to look at the forearm muscles and to problem solve their names, right? Because it will help you when you get into a situation in which you're stressed, you need to problem solve your way through it instead of rote memorization. Everybody understand that? Okay, do you have questions? Okay, so I will show you like I showed the last class. They wanted to see what the questions might look like. You can't answer this, but you can look at it. It's just not set up for your class. So, how can I ask you muscle action questions that don't require you to have memorized the actions yet? I can actually ask like this, so I want you to think about it, okay? And use your body. It's there for your tool. So, which action is possible for a muscle with an origin on the anterior surface of the humerus and an insertion on the coronoid process of the ulna? So, figure it out, think about it, and then we'll talk about it. And this will be the first one of your quiz next time, so hopefully you'll get it right. But it will not be 100%, I promise you. And see that there is like a way that you can actually figure it out by process of elimination too, right? When you understand it, the other answers don't make sense. Think you got it? You guys are being frighteningly quiet today. Okay, what do you think it is?
B.
Flexion of the forearm. Do you guys agree with her? Flexion of the forearm. Okay, tell me how you knew. Anybody, tell me your thought process. Doesn't matter. There's not a wrong thought. Well, there is, but it's probably not going to be wrong. You got the right answer. How'd you figure it out?
Because it's indent to surface of the humerus is crossing the...
So it's anterior surface of the humerus, right? Crossing the elbow. Do you remember where the coronary process of the ulna is? If you do, right? If you do, then you know that it's actually going to pull it this direction, right? If I hadn't written this question carefully and hadn't given you anterior surface, then you probably wouldn't be able to tell whether it was a flexor or an extender, right? That makes sense? So I have to write the question so that you can figure it out based on the context. The other way these questions can be written, again, is I give you the action, right? And I say, okay, which one of these two is the origin and which one's the insertion? Does that make sense? Okay. So that's what your quiz is going to be like on Monday, to figure out whether you're actually starting to get them down. And it's really not about memorization yet, except you need to know where the bone parts are. Even the bone parts aren't that hard. You should have already memorized that, right? All the bones? Yeah? Okay. Everybody good? Questions? No? You guys are not speaking to me today? What the hell did I do? Oh, we had a test last time. I see. We're not friends anymore. Well, fine. You made your average on the multiple choice part, which does not mean it's actually your average, because some people could have left the entire short answer blank. Your average was an 80, which is about as good as you ever get in anatomy. So I don't know if it's going to stay there, go up or go down when I grade the short answer, but that's a decent start, right? So nobody made 100, but somebody missed 1 on the multiple choice, so that's great. I'm excited about that. Okay, so any questions? No? Are you sure? Okay. Do you think I'll let you go if you don't ask questions? Because, no. Okay. All right. So now what we are going to do is switch gears. We are going to switch gears into muscles as they're related to physiology instead of muscles as they're related to lab. This stuff is not going to be reinforced by lab. It is fundamental for you guys in phys, though, okay? And one of the things I need to give you a heads up about in phys is that nobody will reteach you the anatomy that you tried to forget before they start teaching you physiology. They're going to expect for you to retain the terminology associated with anatomy to get the phys. And why do we not reteach you the anatomy? Because it's hard enough to fit the damn phys into a semester, right? If I try to teach you something and you don't know any of the words, you got to go home and learn the damn words, right? Okay, so let's just start out with the basics of muscle tissue first. So muscle tissue, this stuff is in chapter 10. So the stuff that we've been doing before is in 11 and 12, right? But I wanted to make sure I did it so that you had it at the same time you were working on it in lab. So in chapter 10, it's really about muscles all the way down to the submicroscopic level. So what we do is we take a whole muscle and you kind of know how it's attached to the bone by the tendon and everything. And then we drill down far enough that you can actually understand the molecular mechanisms that allow for muscle contraction. So it takes a minute to get there, okay? So first, let's talk about what muscle tissue is like, all 3 kinds of muscle tissue. All 3 kinds of muscle tissue are what we call excitable, meaning that they can receive and respond to an electrical stimulus, right? What other tissue is also excitable? Nervous, yeah, exactly. So you've got those 4 excitable tissues. Those are your electrical tissues. If that doesn't make sense to you, I want you to think about which tissues would get jacked up by being electrocuted. Heart, you might crap yourself, that's smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle does this, right? And you can fry your damn brain too, because all of those are electrically excitable tissues, okay? But then muscle, all 3 types of muscle do something special when you stimulate them. They have what's called contractility, meaning that the cell was this long and I stimulated it and then it went that long. And that's important because if it was attached here and here and you pull them together, you can wiggle the things it was attached to, right? So that's called contractility. What muscle is really doing is it's taking chemical energy in the form of ATP and converting it to mechanical energy or kinetic energy. You with me? Okay. And when it does that, it's actually really energetically inefficient. And so you lose a lot of what as a byproduct? Heat, yes. And so we can both use that to our advantage. Like when we shiver, when we're cold, we're contracting and relaxing skeletal muscle really quickly to generate heat as a byproduct. Or it can actually be something that we have to work to overcome. Like when you're working out and your body heats up, you have to turn on your cooling system to maintain your temperature homeostasis, right? Okay. Muscle is stretchable, So you can stretch the connective tissue and the ligaments and tendons within it, and it'll give you more range of motion. Like if you start doing yoga or Pilates or something, you're going to get more range of motion in the same muscle, but it's also elastic. It doesn't like stretch and then stay flaccid. You know what I mean? It has some snap back to it. So the only other thing that I need to do to ask you to do here is before you have your muscle test, which will be a while from now, right? I need you to review the 3 types of muscle tissue from the table that you had in your histology notes and know that you're responsible for it again, okay? So I'm not going to go over it again because that's a waste of time. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the functions of muscle tissue and then we'll get into the structures. Okay, so of course, mostly what we think about muscle doing is motion, either wiggling you around or wiggling things around within you. But muscle is also responsible for keeping you still, for like postural stability. You couldn't sit there and hold your head up unless you had some degree of muscle contraction in your neck, right? And I couldn't stand in front of you if I were paraplegic or quadriplegic, right? So just to hold yourself still in postural stability is also muscle contraction. Good. Stabilizing your joints. So if you have a really weak joint, they tell you to stabilize the muscles around it if at all possible, right? So if you have a bad back, they don't say don't use your back because it's not an option, right? You need to stabilize the muscles around it in both your back and your abs. Muscle is, of course, responsible for heat production, like we just said. Some places muscle is actually supportive. It's like holding stuff in place, like these muscles right here. Your pubococcygeal muscles, these muscles, they keep your junk up in there, right? Urinary bladder, uterus, all that stuff's supposed to stay up in there. Ladies, if you have a whole bunch of big-headed babies, you can rip the hell out of those muscles, and you can have what's called uterine prolapse, in which your uterus and your urinary bladders kind of flop around down there. Okay, birth control, that's all I'm saying. Okay, here, muscle is also supportive because intact abdominal muscles squish your guts up against your body wall, right, and help support your guts. The only time that becomes an issue is if you rip those muscles, like with an emergency surgery, you can rip those muscles and you can actually no longer sort of have the packing tape to hold them back against the wall, and you get a pooch even if you don't have a lot of subcutaneous fat. That happens a lot of times with emergency abdominal surgery, which sometimes women have with emergency cesarean sections. If you have an emergency cesarean section, you are far more concerned about keeping the mother and the baby alive than you are about whether you actually damage the muscle in the process. So they'll just slice through one way or the other, okay? And then you will lose those intact muscle fibers, and instead of having one big piece of packing tape, you have a little one and another little one, and then it ends up pooching out. That make sense?
It's basically just a hernia, right?
Kind of, yeah, exactly, right? But just this way instead of down, right? If, however, you have, I had a planned cesarean section because I can't go through labor because I have a heart problem. But they knew it was happening, so they just picked all the fibers apart and didn't actually cut any of them with a planned cesarean section. So you don't get the same pooch necessarily. Muscles, of course, guard openings like sphincters. And then your muscles, all 3 kinds, keep your fluids moving in your body. So we know, of course, that cardiac muscle causes your blood to move, right? But also the smooth muscle within the walls of all tubes keeps fluids moving, right? But then also skeletal muscle keeps fluids moving through tubes as well. It may sound counterintuitive, but if I have in my leg blood and also lymph are traveling back toward my heart at relatively low pressure, if you squish on the vessels, because I'm actually walking around or running around, right? If you squish on the vein, what it will do is it will push blood back toward the heart, especially since the vein has one-way valves in it. Right? So you kind of move it up, like moving up a roller coaster, right? And so the more active you are, not only the better arterial flow you have because of what your heart is doing, but the better venous flow you have because of what your skeletal muscles are doing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so what we are going to do now is we're going to try to put together the gross anatomy to start building down to the microscopic anatomy, which is where we're going to get next time for microscopic anatomy. So, organization of skeletal muscle. So first, just a little terminology. Anytime you see the prefix MYO or the suffix MYS, it means muscle. And it's usually used to refer to gross anatomical structures. MYO and MYS are usually gross structures. If you see the prefix sarco, it means flesh. It's usually used to refer to microscopic structures that are muscular, microscopic muscle structures. Now, I hate to tell you, but it's just freaking true. Some Yahoo decided to rename every damn thing inside a muscle cell with the prefix sarco. So all that crap that you learned in 1610 about the internal structures of cells, they renamed every damn thing. And you have to know them. Why? Because I'm a jerk? No, because that's how they teach them in phys as well. So you have to learn this terminology like this. Like, okay, you can't call it cytoplasm anymore, it's sarcoplasm. You can't call it the endoplasmic reticulum, it's the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's not even called a cell membrane anymore, it's called a sarcolemma. Okay? And it's really rude. But they did it to me too, and I wanted to flip them all off, but I didn't get to decide that either. So we'll come to that in just a second. The only other thing to remember before we get into this is that because muscle cells are so long and skinny, they use the term muscle fiber and muscle cell interchangeably. Okay, so a muscle fiber is a cell. Good? Okay, so first thing is let's start with the gross anatomy and try to figure out how your muscles are attached to your skeleton and then how your muscles are actually wrapped. Okay, so stuff you have known before. Let's make you bring it up again. Okay, of course, muscles will end at both ends in tendons, yes? Okay, and tendons are made of what kind of tissue? Dense, regular, right, with a whole bunch of collagen fibers in it, right? Okay, but then the tendon actually weaves into the fibrous layer of the periosteum on the bone, and the fibrous layer of the periosteum on the bone is made of what kind of tissue? Dense, irregular. So why is it rare but not impossible for you to pull a tendon off a bone? Because what happens is you actually weave those two tissues so that they're continuous with one another. So I take those really highly organized collagen bundles, right, and I weave them into the collagen bundles of the periosteum, right? So instead of having a seam where the two tissues come together, I have a continuous fabric. And if we just think about fabrics, are you more likely to tear a fabric at a seam or within the body of the fabric? At a seam, exactly. So this is continuous. Does that make sense? Okay. Likewise, so we just had the tendon and attached it to the bone. Now let's attach the tendon to the muscle. What we do is the muscle is wrapped in connective tissue. Before you actually get to the muscle tissue, it's completely wrapped in connective tissue right here. The connective tissue that wraps all the way around is called epimysium. Epi meaning on, and myce meaning muscle, on the muscle. Epimysium is made of dense, irregular connective tissue as well. Okay, and so what happens is the tendon, again, weaves into the epimysium. So you have a really strong continuous fabric from the outside of the muscle to the tendon to the outside of the bone. So it's rare, but not unheard of, that somebody yanks a muscle off a bone. Usually it happens in sports like football, right? Because you know football ain't good for you, right? I'm from Texas. I know it's complete blasphemy to say that, but I wouldn't let my kid play football for nothing because I want their brain to function later. So, epimysium wrapping all the way around. All right. So can we agree that this muscle is, for instance, in this dude, going to be under some pressure? Yes? So I need a really strong connective tissue association to hold that muscle together as that dude tries to lift whatever freaking car he's going to try to lift today. I don't even know what the hell's going on right there. But I do know enough physiology to know that his testicles are probably not that big with the amount of steroids he's using, right? It makes him shrink up to the size of English peas, okay? And we know that this did not happen with natural testosterone levels, right? I don't even know how he functions. It seems like it would be hard to function as a human with muscles like that. Right, how do you get your seatbelt on? How do you pick up your kids? You have to have fat kids. Okay, so the muscle is going to be under a tremendous amount of stress. So what we have to have is a really, really strong connective tissue association. So we actually take what we just learned a second ago and make it even stronger by doing this. Okay, so the epimysium wraps around the whole muscle, but then you thin it out a little bit. It changes tissue type just a little. Don't worry too much, but it's kind of like a hybrid between on a realer connective tissue and a dense irregular, a little thinner than dense irregular. We take that and we wrap it around bundles of muscle fibers. A bundle of muscle fiber like this is called a fascicle. The connective tissue that wraps around the outside of the fascicle is called the perimysium. Okay, epi, peri, okay, not done yet though. Each one of these fascicles, bundles of muscle fibers, is composed of individual muscle cells or fibers, yes? And I take that perimysium and I wrap it around each individual cell as endomysium. Again, it thins out a little bit, has a little less collagen in it, right? But you've got a tremendously strong association if you realize that the epi, the peri, the endo are all continuous with one another, yes? And the epi is continuous with the tendon, and the tendon is. Then you can see why that dude has not ripped one of his muscles off at any point yet. Probably. Don't know, maybe. Okay? So, please note that it goes epi, peri, endo. Okay? E-P-E. Now, you could, I mean, it wouldn't not make sense to have peri on the outside. So stick with me for a second. How do you remember that it goes epi, peri, endo? Peri would make sense on the outside, right? But would epi make sense one layer down? No. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's EPE, epi, peri, endo. Cool? Okay. So now what we need to do is drill down a little bit and look at how muscles are actually going to work. You ready? Okay, so here's the deal with this whole muscle. I don't know what this one is. It looks like it's trying to be like one of the heads of the biceps brachii. Can't exactly tell. But in order for this muscle to work, I will tell you it needs a really, really good blood supply. Muscle is highly, highly vascular, yeah? And generally the blood supply goes, depending on how big the muscle is, you're going to have one artery and one vein coming somewhere along the belly of the muscle, but if it gets bigger, like the gluteus maximus, it's probably going to have more than one artery, right? And then what it's going to have to do is split into a bunch of smaller arteries and arterioles. But then importantly, what it's going to have to do is it's going to have to snuggle around every single cell within the muscle. Every single cell in the muscle has to have microscopic access to oxygen and nutrients. So this tissue is going to be crazy amounts of vascular. Here's a picture. So do you remember, like, this looks like skeletal muscle, right? Okay. What you are seeing is the capillary network that wraps around every single muscle fiber. So muscle is truly, truly vascular, and that's part of the reason that when you eat a steak, which is a cross-section of a cow muscle, yeah, cross-section of a cow muscle, it's really red, especially before you cook it. One of the two reasons that it's really red is that every single cell has capillary network completely around it. And so what you're looking at is a whole bunch of oxygen bound to hemoglobin in all of those capillaries. If you leave your steak out on the counter for a little too long before you cook it, what happens to the color? Yeah, it becomes brown as the oxygen dissipates off, right? Or if you cook your steak, of course, heat is going to make the oxygen dissipate off more quickly, right? If you cook the living hell out of it, you can get rid of all of the oxygen and waste a perfectly good steak, right? If you're eating them well done, right? I know people like that, right? I don't even understand you. I'd rather just not eat steak at all than eat a well done steak. Okay, so part of the reason that the steak is red is because you're seeing all of the oxygen bound to hemoglobin. There's another reason too. We'll get to it in just a second. Okay, now, in addition to being highly, highly vascular, every single skeletal muscle fiber has to be what we call highly innervated. Okay, so I want to tell you guys what I mean by this. I mean that if I had 10,000 muscle fibers in a single skeletal muscle, yeah, every single one of them has to be told what to do directly by the nervous system, or else it does absolutely nothing. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's innervated. Now, cardiac muscle doesn't have to do it that way. How can cardiac muscle get around every single cell having to be told what to do? Gap junctions, yeah. So if I tell you and you're connected to all of those guys, you'll tell them, right? Okay. But with skeletal muscle, what you have to have is, so here is an individual skeletal muscle fiber, right here. Here's 3 of them. What I want to tell you is if with these 3 fibers, if I cut this innervation, all 3 of them are paralyzed. Yes? But what if I just cut that innervation? Just that one's paralyzed. Okay. And the nervous system is not fantastic at re-innervating. So depending on how badly you damage the innervation to a muscle, you can have temporary, partial paralysis up to complete paralysis. The central nervous system, meaning your brain and your spinal cord, are almost never going to regenerate. So if I have spinal cord damage versus nerve damage out here, the likelihood of reinnervation and reworking my skeletal muscles is damn near 0, right? Does that make sense? Just because the nervous system has to work for the muscle to work. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is innervation is what we're talking about. And so basically the place at which the nervous system talks to the muscle is right here. It's called the neuromuscular junction. It's a type of synapse. Have you ever learned about synapses? Synapses are where the nerve talks to things. You won't be tested on this in anatomy, but you will in phys. So what happens at the synapse is you actually release neurotransmitters, which actually electrically excite the cell and will cause contraction. So you get into this physiology in phys. Today and tomorrow, what I'll teach you is the basic anatomy of the muscle cell, and then you won't really understand exactly how it works until phys. I'll just tell you enough to make it relevant, okay? And then you'll get into the really intense phys next time. So everybody okay with that? It's called a neuromuscular junction, and you have to have one on every single cell or else it's paralyzed. Does that make sense to you if I tell you that that is how you can have nerve damage that results in muscle weakness instead of just muscle paralysis, right? Because if I had 3 fibers and I paralyzed one of them, then the muscle still works, but it's lost its tensile strength, right? Okay, so you can go all the way from partial muscle weakness all the way up to complete paralysis, depending on how much of the nerve you actually damage. Is that okay? Okay, all right. So let's just meet some of the structures. So if you go inside a muscle fiber, so first of all, let's go back here for just a second. A muscle fiber is just a cell, but can we all acknowledge that that didn't look a damn thing like all the cells you looked at in 1610? You're like, that was a complete waste of my damn time. Well, no, with an asterisk. This is what a muscle cell or a muscle fiber, a skeletal muscle fiber looks like. And what does it have in common with every other cell? What it has in common is, of course, it's going to have the same basic cell structures. It's going to have a phospholipid bilayer for a cell membrane. It's going to have cytoplasm, going to have at least one nucleus, some mitochondria, all that crap, right? But they renamed everything. And then, of course, it has the extras in here. Like, you're like, what the hell is this? Well, its extra structures are related to its extra function, which is contractility, right? So after we get rid of all of the rest of the stuff and understand what those have to do with anything, we'll start talking about those little Vienna sausage things and how they actually are related to contractility. But we'll get to that next time. First, today, let's just talk about the structural components that are similar to other things. So first off, of course, it has a cell membrane. But let's think about this logically. Where does the cell membrane have to be with reference to the endomysium? Superficial or deep to it? So think about it. Endomysium was the connective tissue that wraps around every single muscle cell, right? Endomysium. Where does the cell membrane have to be with reference to the endomysium? It has to be deep to it, right? Because it's the actual boundary of the cell, right? The endomysium is the tissue that's superficial to it. So, of course, this is taking off the endomysium, right? So deep to the endomysium is the actual cell membrane, only they renamed it because they love us. So cell membrane called sarcolemma. And the sarcolemma is a phospholipid bilayer like every other cell membrane, right? And it's got some proteins embedded in it and crap. So it's pretty similar to other cell membranes. Okay, inside the sarcolemma, we have some stuff. We've got multiple nuclei, right? Can you see why the multiple nuclei that you learned about before end up being peripheral? Because there's no room for them in the middle, right? They end up being pushed up against the surface because the middle of the cell is really full, okay? We've got mitochondria drawn in yellow here. There are a whole bunch of mitochondria in skeletal muscle because it really needs them, okay? And then there are a whole bunch of other stuff, but let's talk about the intracellular fluid or cytoplasm, only now they renamed it sarcoplasm. Sorry. So it's called sarcoplasm. There isn't a whole hell of a lot of it because the thing is pretty full, but there is some. And what's in there actually tells you a decent amount about skeletal muscle. This sarcoplasm has, in addition to the mitochondria, so what do mitochondria do, guys? Yeah, powerhouse of the cell. You learned it in 7th grade. So what does it actually make? ATP. Okay, so we can probably all agree that skeletal muscle is going to need a decent amount of ATP compared to other cells, right? Because skeletal muscle contraction is really energetically expensive. So what is the process of generating ATP? What's it called? The glycolysis, Krebs, oxphos, all together are collectively called cellular respiration. Yeah, cellular respiration. So what we are going to do is we're going to set ourselves up so that we can really, really do this well. Okay, here's how we're going to set ourselves up. Inside skeletal muscle sarcoplasm, even though it's not drawn here, it's not drawn because they're actually just dissolved in the sarcoplasm, I'm going to store two things. I'm going to store glycogen. Glycogen is how animals store glucose. Yes? If you're a plant, you'd store it as starch, but you're not. Okay? I'm going to store glycogen inside each skeletal muscle fiber as a little piggy bank. Okay? And then in addition to that, I'm also going to store oxygen on this protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin is similar to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin binds to and carries what around in your bloodstream? Oxygen. Myoglobin binds to and stores small quantities of oxygen inside each skeletal muscle fiber. So when you are doing cellular respiration and you start out with C6H12O6, how do you get the most out of it? You need, nope. What do you need to get the most out of this? Nope. Oxygen. So what we have just done is set ourselves up for really, really quick access to ATP, right? Because I keep my piggy banks in my fiber instead of waiting for it to come through the bloodstream. It doesn't last you for long, but this is the tissue that keeps you from getting hit by a bus. So even if you haven't eaten in a long time, you need really quick, dependable access to ATP. So what you do is you always have mitochondria, yes? You always have a little bit of oxygen and a little bit of glucose, right? And you can always make ATP, and you do generate water and carbon dioxide as well as byproduct, right? So you're basically making sure that your emergency response tissue is always ready. And the last thing that you do when you finish using your skeletal muscles and you have enough nutrients and oxygen, the very last thing that you do before you drop your metabolism and drop your respiratory and cardiovascular rate is put all that back. So when you stop working out, you may have burned that up when you started, right? But before you stop working out, or when you stop working out before you drop your metabolism, you have to replace all of that oxygen, all of that glucose, right? So that you're ready for the next time a bus tries to hit you, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so you store this on myoglobin. So one last thing to talk about myoglobin is now we have two reasons that your steak is red. It's red because of all of the oxygen bound to hemoglobin in the capillaries around every fiber. And now it's red because of the oxygen bound to myoglobin inside every fiber, right? So the tissue is pink for a reason. Yeah? Okay. Tissue is pink because it's really, really vascular and energetic. Okay. And then the last thing that we are going to talk about, and we won't do much of it today, is next time we are going to get into what are all these Vienna sausage looking things, right? Those are all contractile proteins related to muscle contraction, and just conceptually, what is the difference between my biceps brachii and his biceps brachii? He has more contractile proteins in every single cell than I do. Therefore, can generate more contractile strength than I can, right? And you guys know, of course, that you can actually increase your contractile strength of your muscles based on how you use them. If you feed yourself enough protein, you will make more proteins inside there, and the muscle will get thicker and stronger, especially if you add a lot of testosterone. Like that too, like too much. Can we agree that this is too much testosterone? Just too much, man. Okay, so we'll pick up there next time. I will see you guys on Monday. You have a quiz at the beginning next time I see you. I will post your grades probably by Sunday night or so.